Hello and welcome to 5 Minutes of Postgres. My name is Lucas, and today we're going to talk about improved explained display of subplan nodes. This sounds very technical, but I think it's actually a very nice practical improvement that's coming to Postgres 17. This is a change that Tom Lane committed about a week ago. And in this change, Tom is refining how explained plans are showing what's called a subplan. Now, the important distinction here is, let's say you have a subselect. Postgres may choose to implement your subselect as a join, or it may choose to implement your subselect as a subplan. We'll talk about a few examples of those in a moment. So really, this is mainly a display change. This particular change here does not change when subplans are issued, but personally, I've definitely ran into this being quite confusing, and so I think this is a great improvement. Now, let's take a look at these changes. So in the Postgres documentation, there's now a new section on the Using Explain page, which talks about query plans that involve subplans. As noted, a subplan will arise from a subselect in the original query. Some queries end up just being ordinary join queries, but then sometimes queries don't have that. And so what you will see, and you also saw this in previous Postgres versions, is what's, for example, here shown as subplan 1, which means that, for example, in this case, it's doing a sequential scan on this table, and then for each of the rows, it's issuing that subplan to get the additional data that we're, in a sense, joining against, but it's not really a join, right, because it can't be represented in a regular join dynamic. Now, before we jump into these examples, it's maybe worth calling out what these tables here are. So oftentimes when you read the Postgres documentation, you will see this 10K or 1K table. And these are example tables that are used in the Postgres regression tests that are also sometimes used in the Postgres documentation. And so if you're interested how these tables look like, you can look at the regression test source of Postgres, and you can see that the 10K table, for example, has quite a few different columns, mostly integer, with a few text columns here. Now, as the name says, 10K, this is a table with 10K rows. Now, similarly, there's a 1K dataset, which is 1,000 lines, that's stored in the 1K table. And so if you see references to these datasets in the Postgres documentation, you can just understand that 1K is 1,000 rows, 10K is 10,000 rows. And sometimes you'll also see 1K2 or 10K2, that this is the same data, just copied to a separate table to represent more complex join behavior. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at a few examples and compare them between 16 and 17. So first of all, this is an example where the subplan gets executed once for each of the rows in the parent plan node. And so if I execute this on 16, which I have running here, I will see a plan like this. If I execute it on 17, plan looks slightly different. Now, the big difference here is if you look at that filter state. So previously on 16, you would just say that the filter said subplan 1, but it didn't really tell you what it was filtering on, right? And so even though our query actually had a comparison here of the lower than operator and the all, that wasn't really clear from the explain plan. And so in 17, what's really nice here is we can see the actual expression. This also is multiple column, but easy to understand. And in this case, one of the columns is essentially being pulled out, and that's what's used in this comparison. So when you have more complex cases, this is going to make it much easier to understand. Now, just to illustrate two more things. So first of all, in this case, we can see that this is actually executing it once per row. And so if I add an analyze here, what we can see is that this subplan here actually does get executed 10,000 times. Because for each of the rows in the 10K table, I'm executing this subplan. And so that's something that was there before in 16 as well, but it's important to remember that. Now, the other thing I can illustrate in this plan is that if I change the all to an any, you actually see that now this turns into a join. So Postgres has certain logic where we'll do what's called subquery pullup. And so instead of the subselect being executed as a subplan, it actually now becomes part of the top plan. Generally speaking, that will give you better plans. So Postgres tries to do it whenever possible, but sometimes that's not possible, and then you will see a subplan in your query. Now, the next example illustrates what's called a hashed subplan. So this is something that I personally always found very confusing when it happened. And so on 16, it looks quite confusing, which is literally just says, okay, the filter is when not this hashed subplan, and it doesn't really tell you much. Now on 17, this is much clearer to understand because now it's saying, well, there's an any clause here, right? Postgres turns this not in into not any, and then it compares unique one, which comes from the outer 1K table, to the first column of the subplan, which in this case is also unique, right? Because that's the first column that's being returned here. And so this is now much clearer, right? If you look at 16, very confusing. 17, much clearer to understand. Now, the last example here is of what's called an InitPlan. And if you see InitPlan, what that means is that Postgres will execute that subplan once at the start of the query, and then we'll be able to reference the result multiple times potentially, but it doesn't have to rerun that subplan. And so in this example here, we're just selecting a random number. And so that doesn't change depending on the input. Now in Postgres 16, I get a little bit of a verbose output here. So it says this InitPlan 1 returns $0, and then here it's essentially a comparison of $0. Now in Postgres 17, this is slightly refined. And so we're losing this $0 definition here. It can be a bit confusing. And instead, it's just referencing the InitPlan, and it's saying, here's this column 1. All in all, this should make it easier to understand how your subplans and InitPlans behave in your explain plans. Again, this doesn't change the behavior, but it just makes it easier to understand what Postgres is doing. So thank you for the community and to Tom Lane for committing this patch. I think this is a great refinement in how explain plans get represented. Thank you so much for listening. This was 5 Minutes of Postgres. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear about next week's episode, and talk to you next week.